Today to tell you about one of the greatest gifts that God has ever given. These are these certificates called indulgences. Come and I will give you these authorised certificates, these indulgences that will pardon you even from the sins that you intend to commit. You know, I wouldn't even change places with St. Peter himself, because I have saved more souls through the sale of these indulgences than the Apostle Peter did through any of his sermons. Friends, there is no sin so great that an indulgence can't deal with it. Even if you sinned against the Virgin Mary herself, all you need to do is pay up big and all will be forgiven. But wait, there's more. And it's not a free set of steak knives. These certificates, these indulgences are not just for the living. They are also for the dead. Listen up, you hard-hearted. Did you know that for only $10 you could rescue your dead father from purgatory? Are you so ungrateful that you won't save your father? When the day of judgment arrives, I will be saved, but you will be punished if you neglect this opportunity to save another. And let me tell you that even if you only have a single coat in your wardrobe, you should sell that so that you can obtain this grace. The Lord our God no longer reigns. He has resigned all power to the Pope. Now, friends, that was a paraphrase of a message that was preached 500 years ago by a Dominican monk by the name of Johann Tetzel. He was the Great Commissioner for Indulgences in Germany, and he was a great salesman. And the sale of these indulgences would fill the coffer of Pope Leo X. The money that was raised from these indulgences would go on to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. But it was also this sermon that would light a fuse for a revolution that would sweep across Europe. Now, in 5 weeks' time, our world is going to mark the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, when a Roman Catholic priest by the name of Martin Luther, who was appalled by the sale of and trade of indulgences, that he wrote what was called the 95 Theses. And in it he detailed his opposition to the sale of indulgences. And on the 31st of October 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg in the hope, his hope was he just wanted to try and reform the Roman Catholic Church on this particular teaching. But he didn't realise that what he had written would actually undermine the whole system of the Roman Catholic Church dispensing grace to people. And it would also undermine papal authority. As men and women rediscovered biblical Christianity in all its splendour and glory, they would turn their back on the Roman Catholic Church. Now, over the next 5 weeks, we're going to look at the 5 central ideas that changed the world 500 years ago. But I want to say to you that these 5 ideas still have the power to transform lives today. And we're going to be looking at some of the same passages in the Bible that the reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin and Thomas Cranmer, where they rediscovered biblical Christianity. And the foundational idea that covers them all, across all of them, is the one that we're looking at today, and that is grace alone. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that grace alone is the only way that sinful human beings can come back into a right relationship with God. It is through God's initiative alone. It's not because some people are more deserving. It's not because some people have completed all their religious devotional activities. It's not because they've tried to earn God's favour. It is because God freely and graciously saves those who can't save themselves. And the first step in understanding this idea of grace alone is to understand the spiritual diagnosis that God has given for each and every one of us in this building this morning. Now, this is really important because you know that when you go to a doctor, you want to get an accurate diagnosis, don't you? Because once you've got an accurate diagnosis, you know how you can embark on the right treatment. So here in our passage today, God gives us a spiritual diagnosis of each of us. Look at how the Apostle Paul describes it in verses 1 and 2 of our passage. He says, "As for you, you were sick in your transgressions and sins in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and the rulers of the kingdom of the air, the spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient." Now, is that what it says there? Is what I said written there? Is it? It says in our passage, "As for you, you were dead," not sick. You were dead in your transgressions and sins in which you used to live. You see, we are by nature like this cut flower in a vase. Okay? A cut flower in a vase, it appears as though it's alive, doesn't it? But it is in fact dead because it has been cut off from its source of life. And that's true of us as well. We've been cut off from the source of life, which is God. Instead, we have these two forces at work in our lives that are pulling us in the same direction, actually away from God. One of the forces that Paul identifies here is the ways of this world. A world that tries to operate without God. A world that is either hostile towards God or simply wants to try and ignore God. And so people can just drift along with the world's priorities. The other force that Paul speaks of in this passage that can be at work in our lives is the ruler of the kingdom of the air. Now, we know him by his shorter title, Satan. That's who Paul is talking about there. The one who opposes God and opposes God's purposes in the world. And you see, the thing about following Satan is that you don't have to be a card-carrying Satanist. You don't even have to be a card-carrying occultist to follow Satan. Because what does it say in our passage there? It says, "The spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient." That's all you have to do in order to follow Satan, to just be disobedient, to disobey God. I think most people think that following Satan would somehow be so much sinister and so much darker. But from God's point of view, it is simply disobedience. Now, as I look at you today, I look at a very lovely, nice, respectable bunch of people. And maybe you're here today and you're thinking, you know, what Paul says in these two verses, that's not describing you. It might describe other people, but it's not describing you. But then Paul drops this theological bombshell in verse 3. Have a look at verse 3 with me. It says, "All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath." See, none of us here this morning in this building, including myself, can escape those first three words, all of us. Those three words remind us that all of us here are people with a past that has been marked by disobedience and failure towards God. And you know what? God does not look at us in the same way that we might look at ourselves. See, one of the things I think we tend to do in life is that we compare ourselves to others around us. And I think we sometimes like to compare ourselves with those who have spectacularly failed at life. people who've made devastating choices. We compare ourselves to them, or we think about those people who are particularly evil in the world. And once we measure ourselves against those people, we come out feeling like we have a certain measure of respectability about us. But friends, this false sense of respectability can actually blind us to our dangerous predicament that God is speaking about in this passage. It's like being a terminally ill patient with lung cancer telling your cancer specialist that you've only got a bad chest cold. If we fail to hear what God says here, that we are, by nature, deserving of wrath, deserving of God's anger. See, what God is doing here in these first 3 verses, he's actually holding up a mirror to you and to me so that we can see who we are. And it's not pretty. Apart from God, we are dead. In 1988, I saw my first dead body. I was working as a maintenance electrician at Sydney University, and there was a man who had deliberately electrocuted himself. And it was my job to go and turn off the power supply so they could remove the body from the room. It was an awful, tragic scene. But the thing that I noticed, and I know I'm stating the obvious, but it is this, that dead people cannot do a thing for themselves. You know, if you're sick or if you're in danger, you can call out for help, you can seek help, can't you? But when you're dead, there's not a thing that you can do. And here in our passage, God is telling us that it doesn't matter how accomplished your life might be, you are dead in your transgressions and sins. That each of us at some point in our life have been helpless and hopeless before God. But, and it's here in verses 4 and 5, we learn that it is God alone who makes the difference to our helpless and hopeless situation. Have a look at verses 4 and 5 of our passage. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. Now, friends, just let the truth of that verse penetrate your hearts and minds for just a moment. Here in these verses, the reformers rediscovered, they didn't discover anything new, they rediscovered what had been buried under centuries of church tradition and church teaching. That the only way a sinful human being can come back to a right relationship with God is through God's initiative alone. And that truth, I think, has been captured for us in one of the world's greatest and most famous hymns that was penned by a man whose life was marked by reckless disobedience towards God, a man who traded in the lives of others as a slave trade. He wrote, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, that saved a wretch like you." And just in case we have missed the magnitude of what we're reading here, in verses 8 and 9, Paul repeats the foundational place of God's grace in our life of faith. Have a look at verses 8 and 9. It says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." Here we read about God's unmerited favour towards us. That salvation comes to us as a gift, not something that we have to work for or earn. It's not because some people are more deserving. It's not because people have earned God's favour. It's not because they've paid for God's favour through indulgences. God freely and graciously saves those who can't save themselves. And friends, this is the gift of grace alone. But the thing is that there is absolutely, I can't think of anything else in life that's like grace alone. You know, for much of our life, we find significance in the things that we do, don't we? We find value in the things that we do. We find value in our work, how we've raised our families, whether we've, got a certificate in something or something like that. We find our value in the things that we do. And our society in which we live, our society is built on hard work and achievement, isn't it? That's how our society's been built, hard work and achievement. And this idea of hard work and achievement is constantly being reinforced from the day you start at school till the day you finish in this world. It's being reinforced with things like examinations and awards and performance reviews and promotions. All of those things are telling us that you will get out of life what you put into it, that you will be rewarded for your effort and for your success. But when it comes to God, it counts for absolutely nothing. And I don't think that's easy for us to hear. I think there are times where we're tempted to think, you know what, I've actually helped God out. I've made a contribution. I'm a Christian because, I evaluated all the claims that are made in the Christian faith and it made sense to me, so I made a decision. My contribution. I did it. Or sometimes we might start thinking, you know what, God chose me because I can do this. Or God has chosen me because I haven't done that, like that person. See, there can be these sort of subtle temptations to give ourselves some credit. But grace alone says to you and to me, you did nothing. And it seems to go against every instinct that we have in our own humanity, that we contributed something. Many, many years ago, there was a conference being held in England. It was a conference on comparative religions. And experts from all around the world came to this conference and they were debating that, what if any belief was unique to the Christian faith? And so at this conference, they started to eliminate the possibilities of what might be unique to the Christian faith. So they thought about, well, is the incarnation, the Son of God becoming man, is that unique to Christianity? Well, no. There are other religions where gods appear in human form. What about the resurrection? Surely that must be the unique doctrine, the unique belief that Christians have. Well, no, actually. There are other religions in the world that have accounts of people returning from the dead. And so this debate was raging on until the Christian writer by the name of C.S. Lewis, the guy who wrote The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, those sort of great children's Christian classics, C.S. Lewis wandered in and asked, what's the commotion about? And they told him they were trying to identify Christianity's unique contribution amongst the world religions. And Lewis replied, that's easy. It's grace. It's grace. You see, the other world religions offer a way of winning approval in their religion. So Buddhists have the Eightfold Path that they must follow, or Hindus have the doctrine of karma. Judaism has the law that they must follow. Muslims must follow the 5 pillars of Islam. All of these are about what must I do in order to gain credit and worth before God. All of these things are about tidying up my life in order to win God's approval. But it's only biblical Christianity that speaks about God making the first and only move towards us. And he makes that move in the midst of our failure and our disobedience. Friends, it's only biblical Christianity that speaks of undeserved favour towards the undeserving. That is grace alone. But the question is, why does God deal with us graciously? Why does he do that? It doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. Why does God choose to deal graciously with us? Well, the answer is actually in verse 7. Have a look at verse 7. It says, in order that in the coming ages he might show the incomparable riches of his grace expressed in his kindness to us in Christ Jesus. Now, friends, I don't know what you want to be remembered for at the end of your life. I've done lots of funerals here at St Luke's, and people's lives are often recounted in the eulogies. I don't know what you want to be remembered for, but the one thing that God wants to be known for in the coming ages, for all eternity, he wants everyone to know the incomparable riches of his grace. That's what he wants everyone to know. And every single one of us in this building, if you know God's salvation in your own life, then I want to say to you, you are like one of God's trophies. You're like one of God's precious trophies in his trophy cabinet that declares that he is gracious to the undeserving. That he is gracious to those who are dead in their transgressions and sins. Now, friends, God's grace alone is a glorious truth that was rediscovered at the Reformation. A Reformation that changed the world 500 years ago, but still, I would suggest, still has the power to transform lives today. So I want to just spend a few moments with you thinking about, how does God's grace alone still matter? Why is it not just a theological observation from 500 years ago? Well, there's three things I want to say about grace alone. Firstly, grace alone impacts how you view God. Because if we didn't know about grace alone, we'd have a very superficial view of God, where we would think that God is very similar to us and the other people that we meet. That he is somebody who can be won over by our good deeds. That he is somebody who can be paid off with our religious devotion or our religious activity. And when we do that, we are declaring that the saving death of Jesus on the cross was not enough. Because I can contribute to my salvation. Jesus can save me 90%, but I save myself that last 10%. No. Grace alone gives us a glorious vision of God that I think arouses in the life of us two things: gratitude and thanks. If God is like this, surely he deserves our gratitude and our thanks, and that is the thing that will shape our lives. Second thing, grace alone impacts how we view ourselves. Okay? If we think that it is our effort that wins God's approval, then one of two things will happen. Firstly, if we think that we are reaching the key performance indicators of our faith, that yes, I read my Bible regularly, yes, I say my prayers daily, yes, I go to church regularly, yes, I generously support gospel ministry. If we start thinking about, yes, I've met all those things, we can become puffed up with pride. And our life will end up becoming shaped by joyless duty rather than joyful service. And we'll become filled with self-assurance. But imagine for a moment we don't meet those key performance indicators of our faith. That we know that we've failed God in so many ways. Then we'll be crushed by guilt and uncertainty. We'll never be sure whether we have done enough to win God's approval, and we'll be robbed from any sort of assurance that we can have in life. But grace alone reminds me, and it reminds you, that our salvation is held in God's hands, and they are safe hands. Third thing, grace alone impacts how we view other people. See, if we're not going to be clear about grace alone, then we will start to make the foolish error of comparing ourselves to other people. You know, we might start to look down on others because we don't think that their life measures up. Or we might make the other mistake that we'll look up to people and think, wow, they are fantastic. And we'll put them on a pedestal and think they're terrific Christians. They'll be on a pedestal which they do not belong. And then when they stuff up, it'll give us a crisis in confidence about what the gospel and what the Christian life is all about. God's grace reminds us that all of us stand together. All of us. Whatever age you are, we all stand together. You know, Martin Luther, the German reformer, he understood this really well. His last written words before he died were, "We are beggars." And that's true. Before God, we have nothing to offer. We are beggars before his throne of grace. The message of grace alone is one that can barely be conceived in our merit-based world. We live in a merit-based world, don't we? I hope we can all see that we're rewarded for our activities. In the movie Saving Private Ryan, if you've seen the movie at all, and some of you who are too young, you should not see it until you're a lot older, but in that movie there is a squad of soldiers who are led by Captain Miller, who's played by Tom Hanks, and their mission is to save Private Ryan, okay? To save this guy and send him back to America. And towards the end of the movie, where nearly every single soldier in that squad has been killed in action, Matt Damon, who plays Private Ryan, he's nursing the dying Captain Miller. And Miller's final words to Private Ryan as he dies is, "Earn this. Earn it." In the final scene of the movie, 50 years has passed, and you see the elderly Private Ryan standing at the cross that marks the spot of the resting place of Captain Miller. And this is what he had to say. "My family is with me today. Every day, I think about what you said to me that day on the bridge. I've tried to live my life the best I could. I hope that was enough. I hope that at least in your eyes, I have earned what all of you have done for me." That is the merit-based world in which we live. And it's clear that Ryan has spent his whole life burdened with doubt, wondering if his life has actually lived up to those two words, earn it. 500 years ago, men, women and children were burdened with religious duty in order to get right with God. But with the recovery of biblical Christianity, the glorious truth of grace alone spoke, and it revived the hearts of many, and it changed their lives forever. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. Let's pray.